The cold hit me the moment I stepped out of the car. Sharp, biting, like a warning. Snow blanketed the world in silence, muting everything except the wind that whispered through the mountains. I stared up at the Stanley Hotel, its white facade looming against the darkening sky. The place was empty this time of year, shut down to the public except for a handful of winter staff and a few guests too foolish or too desperate to care about the stories. I was one of them. The trip had been a mistake, a lost bet, a drunken dare. I couldn't even remember what had convinced me to come here alone, to spend one night in the most haunted hotel in America. It had seemed harmless enough in the daylight, the building picturesque against the snow-covered peaks. But as the sun dipped below the mountains, the shadows stretched long and thin like fingers. I checked in quickly. The desk clerk barely looked up as he handed me my key. "4th floor," he muttered. "Try not to wander." I swallowed hard. The 4th floor, the most haunted level. The hallway was empty as I stepped out of the elevator, the lights flickering slightly. The carpet swallowed my footsteps as I found my room. Room 418. It was colder inside than out. The moment I shut the door, I felt it. A presence, something watching. The air was thick, heavy, pressing against my chest. I ignored it, tossed my bag on the bed, checked my phone. No service, of course. The wind howled outside, rattling the old window panes. Somewhere deep in the hotel, a floorboard creaked. A distant thud, then silence. I lay down, telling myself it was just an old building settling. That's all. Then, just as I was drifting off, a voice. A child's giggle, soft, close, right outside my door. I sat up, my breath frozen in my throat. The handle turned, slowly, and something knocked. I couldn't move. The knock had been light, almost playful, but it sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. I stared at the door, heart hammering. Then, another knock. Louder. I swallowed hard. "H? Hello?" My voice barely carried in the thick silence. No answer. Just the wind howling outside and the dull hum of the heating vent. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe the pipes shifted. Maybe... Knock, knock, knock. 3 slow, deliberate taps. The handle twisted again. I bolted upright, grabbing my phone. No signal. I flicked on the bedside lamp, casting long shadows against the faded wallpaper. The hallway had been empty when I arrived. No children, no guests. I forced myself to my feet, every nerve screaming against the idea, but I had to know. I crept to the door, fingers trembling as I reached for the knob. Slowly, I turned it. The door swung open. Nothing. The hallway stretched, dimly lit, lined with closed doors. The air was frigid, my breath curling into the stillness. I exhaled shakily, ready to step back inside when... footsteps. Down the hall, soft, quick, like bare feet against the carpet. I turned my head just in time to see someone, slip around the corner. Small, pale. A child? Hello? My voice came out hoarse. No answer. I should have shut the door, locked it, gone to sleep and pretended I had never seen anything. Instead, I stepped into the hallway. The silence was crushing, the flickering overhead lights humming softly. I followed the direction of the footsteps, stopping when I reached the corner. Another long hallway, empty. Then I saw it. Down at the very end, past the old wooden doors and a dusty antique table, stood a girl. She was facing away, her white nightgown thin, almost translucent. Long, tangled hair spilled down her back, unmoving. She didn't breathe, didn't shift, just stood. My mouth was dry. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to run. But then she moved, not turned, not stepped, just shifted. A twitch of her shoulder, her head tilting ever so slightly, like she knew I was watching, like she was waiting. The air grew heavy, pressing, suffocating, and then the lights flickered, dimming just enough for the shadows to stretch, for her face to turn. My vision blurred, my stomach lurched, because that wasn't a child. The skin stretched too tight, the mouth too wide, and the eyes, black, empty, staring right at me. The light flickered again, and she was gone. A rush of cold wind barreled down the hallway, slamming into me like a wave. I staggered backward, gasping, my breath clouded in the freezing air. The door to my room was still open, but I wasn't alone anymore. Somewhere behind me, something whispered, "Stay." I spun around so fast I nearly tripped. The whisper had been right behind me, but the hallway was empty. No girl, no one, just the long, endless stretch of closed doors, the dim lights buzzing overhead, the weight of the silence pressed against my ears. The air was thick. Wrong. I staggered back into my room, my hands shaking as I shoved the door shut. The lock clicked into place, but it felt useless, like a child pulling the covers over their head, thinking the monsters wouldn't find them. I needed to leave now. I grabbed my bag, but as I turned toward the door, something moved in the mirror. Not me. I froze. The mirror stood across the room, old and warped, the glass slightly fogged from the cold. My reflection stood there, rigid, pale-faced, staring back. But I hadn't moved. A sharp breath crawled up my throat. The reflection blinked, and I didn't. My legs locked, my heartbeat slamming in my ears. It wasn't me. I stepped back. The reflection didn't. Instead, it smiled. Not a human smile, not something meant for this world. Too wide, too many teeth. I sucked in a shaky breath, forcing myself to move. I had to get out. I reached for the doorknob. The lights cut out. The room plunged into darkness. The temperature dropped. My breath came in short, panicked gasps. The air was heavy, suffocating, pressing against my skin like unseen hands. A sound behind me. Not the wind. Slow, deliberate. Footsteps. My throat tightened. I turned, vision adjusting to the dark. The mirror, empty. My reflection was gone, but I wasn't alone. A figure stood in the corner of the room. Not the girl, something else, tall, shadowy. Its head tilted at an unnatural angle, watching me with hollow, bottomless eyes. The same smile stretched across its face. "You should have stayed." The whisper wasn't in my ears this time. It was inside my head. The thing took a step toward me, then another. I ran, fumbled with the lock, threw open the door. The hallway outside was wrong, longer than before, twisting, stretching. Doors lined the walls, but now they were open, and in each doorway something stood, watching, silent. I sprinted, my breath ragged. The end of the hallway felt miles away. I wasn't fast enough. The whispers swirled around me, the air thick with voices, laughing, sobbing, calling my name. Then, the lobby. I burst through the main doors, the icy wind slamming into me. The cold air burned my lungs, but I didn't stop, not until I reached my car, my shaking hands fumbling with the keys. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I knew the Stanley Hotel was still watching. And so were they, because as I drove away, the snow-covered windows lining the upper floor weren't empty anymore. They were filled with faces. The cold came suddenly, swallowing the prairie in a wall of white. One moment the children were playing outside during their lunch break, their laughter rising into the crisp winter air. The next, the wind howled like a living thing, tearing across the fields with an unforgiving force. I was the school teacher, Miss Eleanor Harper, and I should have sent them home earlier. The storm had been predicted, but no one expected it to hit so fast, so violently. One second the sky was clear, the next the sun vanished behind a swirling curtain of snow. I rushed to gather the children inside, my hands shaking as I bolted the door against the screaming wind. The old wooden schoolhouse creaked, the shutters slamming against the windows. Then, the world outside disappeared. The storm was unlike anything I had ever seen. The snow came in thick sheets, so dense it was like drowning in white. The wind groaned against the building, seeping through every crack, bringing a bone-deep chill. I counted the children, 14, all shivering, wide-eyed, bundled in their wool coats and mittens. They sat in clusters near the potbelly stove, but the heat barely reached them. "Miss Harper, when will our parents come?" little Joseph asked, his voice trembling. I forced a smile. "Soon, sweetheart, we just have to wait out the storm." But deep down I knew the truth. No one was coming. Hours passed. The wind grew angrier. The firewood ran low. Night fell, but there was no difference. The world was still dark, lost in the blizzard. The schoolhouse groaned, the wind battering it as if trying to get in. Then, just as I was beginning to doze off, a knock, soft, insistent, right outside the door. Every muscle in my body locked. Knock, knock. The children stirred. Some whimpered. Some sat up, their eyes darting to me. I stood, my breath frozen in my throat. I knew it couldn't be a parent. No one could have survived walking through that storm. Another knock. Harder this time. Then a voice, faint, muffled by the wind. "Miss Harper, let us in." It was a child's voice, but all 14 of my students were inside with me. I couldn't move. The knock came again, louder this time, urgent, desperate. I turned slowly to the children. They were huddled together near the stove, eyes wide, faces pale. They had heard it too. Knock, knock, knock. The voice followed, clearer now. "Miss Harper, please let us in." A child's voice, small, weak, distant. I counted them again, 14, no one was missing. The wind screamed against the wooden walls, the shutters clattering. The blizzard had buried everything beyond the windows in thick, endless white. No one could be outside, and yet... "Who is it?" I forced the words out, my voice shaking. Silence. Then, a whisper. "We don't want to be out here anymore." A creak came from the other side of the door. A slow, dragging sound, like something shifting in the snow. My stomach twisted. I took a step closer, my breath coming in quick, uneven bursts. One of the children whimpered. "Don't open it, Miss Harper." I didn't plan to. I grabbed a poker from the fireplace, gripping it tight. The wind outside howled, but underneath it, something else. A low hum. A sound like children singing. The temperature inside plummeted. The fire flickered, and then the doorknob turned. Slowly, a scraping sound. The lock held, but someone was trying to get in. I stumbled back, my heart hammering. The children clung to each other, their breaths curled in the frozen air. Then came the whisper, closer now, just beyond the wood. "Please, don't leave us out here. It's so cold." A small shadow passed by the frost-covered window. I barely caught a glimpse. Thin fingers, a pale face pressed against the glass. A face I didn't recognize. Something was out there. Something that wasn't supposed to be, and it wanted in. The fire flickered, then it went out. The schoolhouse plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the pale, frozen glow of the snow-covered windows. The whispers outside grew, soft voices, dozens of them, layered over one another, some crying, some laughing, some calling my name. "Miss Harper, please let us in." I backed away from the door, clutching the fireplace poker so tightly my knuckles burned. The children were silent now, terrified. I turned to them, whispering, "No matter what happens, stay together. Do not open that door." A pause. Then from behind me, the entire door shook. The hinges groaned. Something was pounding against it now, harder, more desperate. I could barely breathe. My frozen fingers dug into my palms. "Stay calm, stay calm." Then I heard it, a sound that turned my blood to ice, a single, gasping breath. Inside the schoolhouse, behind me. The air shifted. I turned slowly, and the girl was standing in the corner. She was small, no older than 7 or 8, her tattered dress hanging loose from her thin frame. Her face was pale, her lips cracked and blue, frost clung to her skin, and her eyes, they were hollow, black, empty. She opened her mouth, but no sound came, only that awful rattling breath. One of the children screamed. The girl's head snapped toward them too fast, too unnatural. The air grew colder, the walls of the schoolhouse groaning. The door began to open on its own. Outside, the storm raged, and in the snow I saw them. Dozens, small figures, buried in white, their faces turned up toward the door. Some were missing hands, others had frost-bitten skin turned black. They stood there, waiting, watching. And then the girl spoke. "You left us behind." The wind screamed through the open doorway. The pressure in the room was unbearable, my ears ringing, my vision blurred. I reached for the door, slammed it shut. The voices outside rose in a terrible wail. The wind shrieked. Then, silence. I turned. The girl was gone. The children were huddled together, their eyes wide, breath fogging in the icy air. We stayed that way until morning. When the storm finally cleared, the rescuers found us. We were weak, starving, but alive. But they found something else too. Buried beneath the snow just outside the schoolhouse, the bodies of children, their hands frozen in place, still reaching for the door. And sometimes when the wind howls across the plains, people say you can still hear them, knocking, begging to be let in. The snow swallowed everything. It smothered the trees, buried the path, stretched endlessly in every direction. I could no longer tell where the sky ended and the earth began. The white void consumed the land, and with it, our hope. The first storm came suddenly, sealing us in the mountains before we could reach California. By the time we realized our mistake, it was too late. The passes were impassable, the wind howled like a starving animal, and the food, God help us, the food was running out. I had never known hunger like this before. It gnawed at my ribs, twisted my insides, kept me awake at night. We rationed what little we had. Flour mixed with water into a glue-like paste, scraps of dried meat as thin as paper. But the days stretched on, and the cold stole more than just warmth. It took our strength, our sanity. At night, the wind whispered through the trees, voices in the dark that never seemed to fade. The fire burned low, its glow barely keeping the shadows at bay. Someone cried in their sleep, someone else muttered prayers, hands clasped tight, their breath curling into the frozen air. I stopped praying weeks ago. God had forgotten us here. Then came the deaths. First the old, the ones too weak to fight the hunger. Their bodies lay still under threadbare blankets, their faces hollow, their lips cracked and blue. We dug shallow graves when we could, but soon the ground was too frozen to break. The bodies remained, and the bodies were watching. The first time I noticed, I thought it was the cold playing tricks on me. I woke in the night to find old Mr. Graves lying where we left him. His frozen face turned toward me, eyes wide open. I tried to close them, but the lids wouldn't budge. Hours later, when I looked again, they were shut. The children began whispering of things moving outside the cabins, dark shapes in the trees. But there was no food, no animals, no life in this frozen wasteland. So what were they seeing? The hunger worsened. The snow fell heavier, and then, one night, I heard it. A sound from outside. Not the wind, not the trees, something else. Something that sounded like chewing. The sound didn't stop. It was slow, rhythmic, something tearing, something wet. At first I thought it was an animal, maybe a coyote desperate enough to scavenge near our camp. But when I rose, when I peered through the thin crack between the logs, I saw him. Keseberg. He crouched in the snow just beyond the firelight, his breath curling in ghostly wisps as he leaned over something sprawled in the white. His hands moved with sickening precision, peeling flesh from frozen bone. The body beneath him was motionless, Mary Graves. My stomach clenched, not from revulsion, but from something far worse, hunger. I stumbled back, my breath quick and shallow. I had known starvation before, the kind that hollowed out your ribs and left your limbs weak, but this was different. A new kind of hunger, one that slithered into my bones, whispering that I was foolish to turn away. The next morning, Mary's body was gone. No grave, no explanation, just gone. No one spoke of it. Days passed, the rations ran out entirely. The air inside the cabin turned rank with sweat, sickness, something else. The children no longer cried, they simply watched. Faces pale, eyes sunken, waiting for something none of us dared to name. Then Stanton died. He had been sick for days, his breath rattling in his chest like broken glass. When it finally stopped, no one wept. We only stared. I should have looked away. I should have prayed for his soul for hours. Instead, I watched as the others moved toward him. Caseberg didn't hesitate. He produced a knife from his coat, the blade flashing in the dim light. No one stopped him. No one spoke. The first cut was slow, deliberate. Someone gagged. Someone else turned away, rocking back and forth like a child. But no one left. I should have screamed. I should have run. But the hunger, it smelled like roasted meat. And when Caseberg offered the first bite, no one refused, not even me. The first bite was the hardest. It sat heavy on my tongue, slick with fat, tasting of salt and iron. My body rejected it at first. I gagged, spat, trembled, but the hunger was stronger than revulsion. My hands shook as I took another, and another. We did not speak as we ate. The only sound was the wind outside, howling through the trees, and the wet, quiet tearing of flesh. Caseberg worked in silence, his face expressionless, his hands steady. He had done this before, and he would do it again. After Stanton, it became easier. The bodies we could not bury became something else, something useful, a resource. We told ourselves it was survival, that the dead would have wanted it this way. We lied. The first time a child went missing, no one questioned it. I told myself she wandered into the snowstorm, lost in the blinding white. But there were no footprints, no signs of struggle, only the sound of the wind, and later that night, the scent of something roasting over the fire. I did not eat that night, but the next night I did, and the next. The lines blurred between the lost and the consumed. I no longer asked where the meat came from. None of us did. The gnawing pain in my belly eased, replaced with something colder, something worse. The hunger was no longer in my stomach, it was in my bones. By the time rescue arrived, I had forgotten what real food tasted like. They led us down the mountain, our legs frail, our bodies shrunken. I wept at the sight of open fields, of a sky no longer suffocating with snow. But the hunger followed. Caseberg was the last to leave. They found him alone in a cabin, surrounded by stripped bones, some still wet with marrow. His lips were cracked, his eyes hollow, and yet I swear I saw something flicker behind them. Satisfaction. We parted ways, but he never truly left me. I carried him with me, his whisper slithering beneath my skin. Years passed, but the hunger remained. Food filled my belly, but never enough, never quite. And some nights, when the wind howled just right, I swear I could still taste it, meat. And I wonder, if the snow came again, if the hunger returned, would I resist, or would I welcome it?